Good morning. I would like to welcome everyone here to this special meeting of the Board of Estimates. The purpose of this meeting is to receive a briefing from the Department of Finance and BBMR on the proposed budget for fiscal year 2025. The BOE is meeting in this hybrid format. We'll ask everyone who's joining us here today in person to ensure that your electronic devices are turned off or at a minimum placed on silence so you do not disrupt today's proceedings. If there is an opportunity, I don't think there will be, for folks to speak who might be online, we'll ask that you please state your name, the agency in which you're calling from, and then begin to proceed with your testimony. In the interest of keeping this meeting to the time allotted, I will turn it over now to our amazing CFO. Is he?
Mr. Council President, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Comptroller, members of the board, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. My team and I are here joined by members of the cabinet to present to you the fiscal 25 preliminary budget. What we will do for today is we will walk through key highlights regarding the preliminary budget recommendations, specifically how the budget was balanced. Then we will provide a summary of key general fund revenues. Of the budget. Before I turn it over to Bob to walk through the highlights, I did just want to take a moment to acknowledge the timing of the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse and the release of the fiscal 24 preliminary budget. When I was here before you a couple weeks ago to formally transmit the budget, we had noted that the timing of the bridge collapse in relation to the release of the preliminary budget did not allow for us to make any adjustments to the preliminary budget associated with any costs that may come up regarding the recovery following the bridge collapse or any adjustments to revenue as a result of the collapse. I do just want to note that we are continuing to closely track the costs, not only associated with the response, but now especially with the city's efforts to support individuals impacted by the bridge collapse through the recovery. But we also know that there could potentially be some long-term overall economic impacts that could flow into our budget by way of our revenues. And so that is something that we're closely monitoring in terms of those economic factors. But again, there's no specific provisions in the fiscal 25 preliminary budget that pertain to the bridge collapse. So with that, I will turn it over to Deputy Director of Finance, Bob Senme, to walk through the key highlights.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for having us this morning. So I'm going to pick it up from here and talk first about the highlights for the 2025 budget. So first things first, this is a balanced general fund budget. We started with a $107 million projected shortfall, and we were able to close that with some targeted agency trim, some new efficiencies, and we did not use fund balance to balance this budget. We are continuing to make some targeted investments in some key areas that are of critical importance to the city: violence prevention, consent decree compliance, the Vacancy Initiative, climate action, and procurement transformation, to name a few. We are in this budget starting to think about how we prioritize or transition high priority ARPA investments into other sources of funding, which we'll mention a little bit more in a moment. On the inflationary front, we still are experiencing some cost pressure from inflation. The headline numbers that you see have come down, but a lot of that is we're still catching up, especially on our wages and labor contracts. There's a little catch up we have to do for that high inflationary period we experienced roughly between 2021 and 23. And then education costs will actually go down in 25 by about $3 million, but our investment is still much higher than pre-blueprint levels. We're 47.6% higher in our investment in schools than we were pre-Kerwin levels. Just looking at the top line numbers, so our operating plan is recommended at $3.4 billion. Capital plan is recommended at $654.1 million. That's a total of $4.06 billion overall. and it's a decline of 6.8% versus last year's budget. And we'll talk a little bit later about why that is on both the grant side and the capital funding side. The general fund alone, the piece at the bottom, we're recommending $2.327 billion of spending. That's a 5% increase versus last year. Position count is down by 1.7%, which we'll also talk about in a moment. Just going through the general fund outlook, where we started and how we got to balance. So we started with about $107 million shortfall. And, when we do our first projection in the fall, there are two very big critical pieces of information that are missing or incomplete. One is property tax reassessments, which we don't get generally until December. And we also don't know our contribution amount to the schools, usually until roughly the end of January when the state budget comes out. So those are two big wild cards. And this year, both of those revisions, when we got the final numbers, they both broke heavily in our favor. So we started with about $107 million shortfall. We picked up about $9 million from property tax reassessments for Group 3. We got better by $18.2 million on the schools formula. We thought our costs would go up by about $15 million. They actually decreased by $3 million. And we also at that time were learning that our investment earnings and income tax receipts were trending stronger in fiscal 24, so we were able to build in some of that additional revenue into the 25 forecast. So the net of all that is we started over $100 million shortfall that we thought we'd be facing, and when we got into really the meat of the budget planning process, we were facing a $61.9 million shortfall, which is still a big number to correct for. And the way we balance from there is the list of items you see on the screen here. So with a $61.9 million gap, we realized $58.1 million of savings. We chose to spend an additional $5.8 million on some critical enhancements, which we'll talk about later. And then we did use some one-time resources, $9.6 million of investment income, which we'll talk a little bit about later. We did not use fund balance this year. If you notice, last year, we were relying on $40 million of one-time resources to balance. This year, it's only $9.6 million of investment earnings, which we'll talk about in a moment. Going through each of the savings items. So on that list of items here, I just want to go through the 5 key savings items to give you a flavor of how we came to balance and what we expect in fiscal 2025. So first things first, we did some revenue enhancements where we made some intentional choices to do things differently that would generate more money. So first, we're going to be piloting a different model for parking enforcement on just residential permit parking regulations in fiscal 25. We're going to be enforcing that with license plate reader technology. The license plate reader technology allows us to be a lot more efficient. Some neighborhoods and more that will come online over the course of the year apply for RPP permits just with their license plate, which means we can use the technology on the windshield of a vehicle to enforce those much more efficiently, with minimal need for enforcement officers to get out of their cars. Parking penalties, we had turned off parking penalties during COVID as an emergency protective measure. We've decided to turn those back on as of July 1st. We're also introducing legislation in council to close what we see as a loophole in our parking tax law, where online brokers and aggregators of parking are able to avoid a portion of the parking tax. So we've already reached out to the council president. We'll be introducing legislation to try to fix that. And then we'll also be submitting a package of fines and fees enhancements to the board. We have a lot of our fines and fees that just haven't kept up with the inflationary trends over the last few years, where we think we can, make sure that we're fully covering the cost of the delivery of the fine or the fee. And that'll total about $1 million. Next big item is budgeting for other post-employment benefits, what we call OPEB. And so what happened here is the city transitioned our retirees to what are called Medicare Advantage plans in 2021. That action made a significant dent in our long-term liability. And as you can see on this chart, our current assets almost cover all of our liabilities in our OPEB fund, which is the benefits for retirees. So we're 97.7% funded, nearly fully funded, which is great progress. What that has meant for us is that our actuaries determined that we no longer need to make catch-up payments that we were making in the budget each year to try to achieve 100% status over a longer period of time. So there are savings related to that we can take in the 2025 budget. We also took a step of eliminating some vacant positions in the 2025 budget, and I wanted to give some background first on why we did that and what the trends are. So when we started fiscal 24, you can see from this chart, we had 3,000, over 3,400 vacant positions out of about 14,000 in the budget, very high vacancy rate. Over the course of the year, the civilian vacancies has come down. So we filled a lot of civilian positions. The sworn vacancies is still trending up more slowly, but net we're down by 8% versus what our vacancies were at the beginning of the fiscal year. Even given that trend, we went into the 25 planning process with an intentional goal of trying to find long-term vacant positions that we just felt we didn't need anymore. This is feedback we got from the council hearings last year as well. And we did in the 25 budget eliminate 89 long-term vacant positions. We did this in conjunction with the agencies. We worked with agencies to, again, first find positions that were vacant for a long period of time, and also look for areas where maybe the, process improvements we've gained, either with better technology since COVID, might have left us with positions that we just didn't need anymore. And so that exercise resulted in us eliminating 89 positions for a total savings of $13.3 million. I did want to note on the police side, we did end up reinvesting some of those savings into civilian positions, which we're going to talk about in a little bit later in the presentation. On the other agency spending side, we also asked agencies to identify 5% reductions in their budget. We didn't need to take all of those, but once we got all those proposals, we looked through and tried to identify ones that made sense where we didn't need that spending anymore. And again, the priority here was we wanted to, avoid, if at all possible, any kind of service impact. And we think we were able to do that. The ones that you see listed here are the big ones that total $20 million. So in the health department, we've moved to a arrangement with city schools where they're actually covering some of the cost of school health services for 35 schools. So we've just right-sized our budget. Our budget still reflected that we were covering all of those school health suites. In the category called miscellaneous general, we were spending about $2.7 million there, funded there for the support that Ernst & Young was providing to the city to do our COVID, to handle our FEMA reimbursements related to COVID-19 spending. That is going away. We're finalizing all those reimbursements. We will not need that money in fiscal 25. On IT, we're just transitioning into the implementation phase to more of the execution phase of Workday. So we no longer need as many support costs through consultants that were helping us to implement phase 3 of the project. Police department, $2 million of savings related to overtime. We think that some of the actions we're taking on professionalizing and civilianizing the department will lead to some sworn officers being able to go from civilian functions back into typical sworn functions, which will reduce our overtime costs. On housing, $1.8 million of savings. Portion of that is from reducing the budget for the community catalyst grants, which we've learned over many years that we haven't been spending all of the money there. And we still have about $3.5 million of carry forward that's in fiscal 24 that we haven't spent yet. So we felt safe taking that line item down. For finance, the $1.3 million of savings, we're today relying on consultants to help us run our weekly, bi-weekly payroll. And as we fill city positions, we'll be able to reduce those contractual costs going into 25 for savings. The Royal Farm CFG arena is just us budgeting for the new arrangement. In the old arrangement, we had to pay for some of the utilities in the building and a management fee. The new arrangement for the CFG arena, there's no spending contribution that the city needs to make to the operator. There's a arrangement on the other side of a revenue split about how much the city keeps and how much the operator keeps, but there's no need to have the money on the expenditure side of the budget. And then that last $1.9 million, that's among basically every other agency. We took small trims from almost every agency. So that 1.9 is among the other ones that you don't see listed here. So the sum of that was $20 million of savings. One thing I wanted to touch on before we moved on is you had seen on the first page in our balancing that we decided to spend some money on enhancements and some money for ARPA transition. I wanted to explain the ARPA transition because we don't have a separate slide here about that. We are looking at the ARPA rules. We're monitoring the ARPA rules. The feds are basically putting out guidance about when you have to transition if you have positions that are being funded by ARPA, they're putting out guidance on when you need to transition them to another funding source. There's a little bit of uncertainty now whether that's the end of 2024 or whether that's the end of 2026, the final spend deadline. So we did set aside $1.7 million just in case we need to move ARPA funded positions for stuff that we really want to preserve in the second half of fiscal 25, because the ARPA rules are on a calendar year basis, but half of that would fall into our fiscal 25. So we're still monitoring that. We don't have final guidance for sure, but we wanted to make sure we would have that available if there was any things that we wanted to preserve if that guidance doesn't work in our favor. We also have investments and enhancements, which Laura is going to touch on later in the presentation. Wanted to close this section by saying we did, some significant community engagement this year. The mayor was really insistent that we get out into the community and talk about the budget and hear from our residents about what they wanted to see. We did 4 really great engagement events. 2 of them were in person, 2 of them were virtual. We had over 100 participants from all over the city, and there will be continued engagement opportunities, of course, starting tonight with taxpayer nights for folks to come and provide, give their opinion either in person or over the phone or virtual about the budget that we're presenting today. So next, moving on to revenue, I want to go through our revenue forecast in the general fund for fiscal 25. So in terms of overall picture where the money comes from, the composition of our revenue sources hasn't changed that much, about half from property tax, 20% from income tax, and 30% from everything else. Property tax revenue will be up 6.7% in fiscal 25, and that is driven by our real property assessment growth that we're seeing for Group 3. So Group 3 is what was reassessed. We got that date in December. The growth you can see in the bottom here, this is triennial growth over a 3-year period, is 17.9%. That's pretty strong by city historical standards. If you look at the history of the last 11 years, we've had 11 straight years of growth, but 25 and looking back at 24 were 2 of the highest years we've had, the 2 highest years over the last 11. So that's the good news. The bad news is we are still lagging behind statewide averages, but historically speaking, this is a strong level of growth for the city. On the property tax rate side, we're leaving the rate unchanged at $2.248 per $100 of assessed value. We also, remember, have the targeted homeowners tax credit that reduces the effective rate for owner-occupied properties. That will remain at $2.048 per $100 of assessed value. Tax credit costs will become less expensive by $2.5 million. We're projecting in 25, and that's simply the reflection of some tax credits, especially enterprise zone tax credits and CHAP tax credits that are now burning off the full 10 years with those properties coming back online. We are doing a tax credit work group right now that folks might have heard of to look at our tax credit portfolio as a whole, but we don't have any recommendations in the 25 budget yet to reflect any proposed changes to the mix of our tax credits. Transfer and recreation taxes will be down by $4.8 million, we believe, in fiscal 25. And this is a pretty simple explanation. We had this, boom, this peak in fiscal 22 that lasted into 23 because there was so much activity in the housing market. That has now cooled off, and we're going back to what I would call more customary levels where our transfer and recreation taxes come in anywhere between 90 and 100 million. The bad news is that the number of transactions has come down significantly, and we think it will continue to come down in 25. The good news is, at least what we're seeing in the data, is that we're holding the value of those transactions, which means that some of that price appreciation we saw over the last couple of years, it looks like we're retaining it, which we think is a good sign for our housing market. Income tax, we're projecting up 4.2% in fiscal 25. As you heard Laura mention, we're not building in anything for kind of Key Bridge impact yet. We're still looking at that. The good news here that we're seeing is that our labor market is really strong. Our city unemployment rate is under 3%. That's the first time since 1990. We're also starting to see data that is listed on this slide. We get to see income tax data return, not individual tax returns, of course, but we get to see summary level data from the state. And, the trend here is that we still are seeing increases in those middle income levels from $30,000 to all the way up through $500,000 adjusted gross income for households. We're seeing more taxpayers. Now, the one caveat to this data is 2022 is probably still a little bit of a quirky year because it's compared versus 2021, which was a pandemic year when you had some people out of work or, a lot of different situations. But this has been a slow trend we've seen over time that our kind of middle income areas are strengthening, which we hope is a good sign of things to come. Highway user revenue, we're expecting an increase of $41.3 million in fiscal 25. Virtually all of that will go into additional capital projects. The good news is the budget conversation that was happening at the state level, there was the potential for us to lose some highway user revenue in fiscal 26 and 27. That has been resolved. So we have maintained our share for 25 at 11% of the statewide total. And the indications we're getting is that we'll still get the 12.2% share of the total in fiscal 26 and fiscal 27 based on the deal that was worked out at the state level for the budget. We're still looking ahead, of course, to 28 and beyond when our level will kind of revert back to pre-law levels. And, we'll have some work to do to try to kind of justify those higher levels more going forward. Investment earnings, we're expecting up $15.6 million in fiscal 25. Two dynamics here. One is the Fed over the last couple of years took some pretty aggressive actions to bring the interest rates up to tame inflation. That has a positive effect on our budget because we earn more on our shorter term investments. We also are utilizing cash balances from ARPA. We are allowed to invest ARPA funds that we have not yet spent and bring the return into our general fund. So those are the two things that we're driving the high 24 amounts you're seeing and the higher 25 budget. We are assuming investment yield in fiscal 25 of 4.5%. That's a little bit lower than the market rates now, which are around 5%. The Fed was saying that they were going to cut interest rates next year. The news that came out earlier this week was that inflation was higher than they expected, which might mean that they're not as aggressive about reducing rates, which would mean we'd have a little bit of cushion here in our investment earnings budget. Tourism and visitor revenues, this is hotel and parking. So hotel, our average room rates have been creeping up each year since COVID. They're up to $168 per night as of the end of 2023, which is a good sign. So we're expecting to see continuing improvement in the hotel tax revenues. And then the parking revenues are up based on the enhancements we had mentioned earlier on enforcement, penalties, and the parking tax legislation that we're putting into place. And then finally, on the revenue side, traffic cameras, we expect up about $800,000 in fiscal 25. There is a planned deployment that DOT is getting ready for 24 new red light cameras in the spring of 2024. So we'll generate some new revenue from those in fiscal 25 and beyond. And so with that, I wanted to turn it back over to Laura to cover the expenditure side.
Oh, wonderful. So as Bob mentioned, the total fiscal 25 preliminary budget is $3.5 billion. Here you're able to see what that looks like in terms of where the money comes from our fund perspective, as well as where the money goes in terms of types of expenditure. In fiscal 25, the general fund will make up about 66% of the city's total budget. The next largest fund group are enterprise and utility funds, followed by grant funds. Do just want to note that utility funds and grant funds swapped in terms of their distribution of the total budget based off of a change in practice on how we're budgeting grants. And I'll talk more about that in a couple minutes. This slide shows the general fund budget specifically broken out by pillar. These pillars align to the mayor's action plan, and we've aligned all of the services within the city's operating budget to the pillar that they most directly impact. So looking at highlights by pillar, first up, prioritizing our youth. So as Bob was mentioning, the budget continues the city's stepped up increased contribution to city schools through the local share. Our 3-year increase in the local share is just over 47%, or about just shy of $126 million in the 3-year period. Again, the local share in fiscal 25 will be coming down slightly by about $3 million. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But also within prioritizing our youth, there is funding in the budget for a partnership between the Mayor's Office of Employment Development and city schools to provide career coaches for all middle school and high school students. So that's part of a 3-year pilot program with the schools, and that will fund 56 positions in MOED. There's also funding in the budget to support 240 year-round spots as part of the YouthWorks pilot program. And all YouthWork employees in fiscal 25 will receive the $15 minimum wage. Now, just quickly in regards to our school funding. So as you all remember from last year's budget, the local share was a big factor in terms of how we balanced fiscal 24. So this slide here shows the city's contribution to city schools going back to fiscal 2001 to the anticipated amount in fiscal 25. So you can see in terms of the 2 years of increase, where we landed in fiscal 24, that was where we were intended to be funding for schools in fiscal 29. A big factor that was driving the local share increase last year was what we call the Education Effort Index. And this is a portion of the school funding formula that compares jurisdictions against each other in order to provide a credit through the state funding formula. And so last year we fell from the tier where we received a 100% credit to the mid tier. And so our credit that we received went from 100% to 35%. That credit will grow now annually. So in fiscal 25, the credit grew to 45%, which is the driver of why the local share is essentially staying flat, or we're seeing that small $3 million decrease. One thing to note, you can see the scores for these index, they fall between 1 and 1.27. In the current funding formula, the city was at 1.19. And so we are within 4/10 of a calculation of going to that bottom tier, which would result in another loss through the Education Effort Index. And we estimate that would cost the city about $15 to $20 million, depending upon the year that would potentially kick in. In building public safety, the budget continues to invest in the gun violence reduction, or the group violence reduction strategy. There's funding for additional positions in Monzi to expand this strategy to the eastern and southern districts. There's also, as Bob was mentioning, additional funding in the police department to continue the professionalization effort, allowing additional sworn positions to get redeployed back into the shift model. Some functions that will be part of the professionalization are training, internal investigations, and various admin functions. In Clean and Healthy Communities, there's funding to implement a building automation system that will allow DGS to better monitor and control energy usage in city-owned buildings. DGS estimates that the upfront investment will pay itself back within 4 years through energy savings in city-owned buildings. There's additional funding that's been added to the health department, $1 million to bridge some loss of funding for the Be More for Healthy Babies program, as well as a mobile clinic that supports patients with opioid use disorders. This funding will help while the health department explores recurring sources of grant funding that can sustain those programs. And then finally, there's funding to continue weekly recycling that was restored earlier this year. The fiscal 25 budget annualizes the cost of 10 crews that were added to the budget for a portion of the year in fiscal 24. In equitable neighborhood development, there's funding for 2 new positions in the Department of Housing and Community Development to support the Vacants Initiative. Additionally, there's an investment of $650,000 in the parking enforcement strategy that Bob described earlier. And there's $1 million for a new grant program to local nonprofits to provide one-time small grants to various arts and cultural institutions in town. And then finally, for responsible stewardship of city resources, the budget includes $592,000 to purchase an electrical charger hub that will be used by fleet to support the transition to electric vehicles by 2030. There's 5 new positions in the Department of Finance to support the Procurement Transformation Initiative. And there's continued funding for various hiring incentives, notably the CDL incentive that will continue through fiscal 25. Now, quickly on some non-general fund highlights, the utility budgets, so water, wastewater, and stormwater. The budgets for these three funds are up by 12.4%, or just under $70 million. Do want to note that the driver of the increases here include the cost of annualizing the pay study that was implemented for utility staff earlier this fiscal year, as well as supporting some higher costs for various contractual expenditures that are provided by the utilities. Next up, for grants, the overall grant budget, so this would be our state, federal, and special awards, are down by 34.5%, or $255 million. I do want to stress that this change does not reflect a loss of grant revenue for city programs. What this reflects is a change in how we're budgeting grants. So historically, we allowed agencies to include appropriation for anticipated grant awards, and what we've done this year is we have told agencies to only budget for known grant awards. And we believe this is a critical step to clean up the city's grants management practices, and that we believe that this provides a more accurate depiction of what the city is anticipating to receive, especially from those state and federal awards. So this, you'll see the impact of this in our grant-heavy agencies like the Health Department, the Housing Department, MONSE, MOED, et cetera. And then just quickly on capital before I turn it over to my colleagues in the planning department, the overall capital program is down by about 21%, or $177.6 million. The biggest decreases here are in revenue bonds. Again, that's borrowing for the water, wastewater, and stormwater utilities. Do want to note that when we look at the general fund back sources, those sources are actually up by about $38.1 million. That's primarily driven by a higher PAYGO capital that is made possible by the increased funding through the highway user revenue. So I will pause there and turn it over to planning. Kira, do you want to switch the slides? Okay.
Good morning, Mr. President, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Controller, honorable members of the board. My name is Chris Farrar. I'm the Director of Planning for the City of Baltimore. Now, how do I advance this? I know, it's not working. Can you? Oh. As you know, by city charter, the Planning Commission must submit a recommendation to you all for the 6-year capital program, the first year of which becomes incorporated into the city budget. The remaining years act as a guide for future capital projects. Capital projects, again, in Baltimore, we define as a project over $50,000. It includes related studies. Does not include vehicles, repairs, and maintenance costs less than $100,000, and salaries for positions that are not critical to the capital project. We recommend a new 6-year program every year, so there's an additional year developed with each 6-year program in each year. That begins in September when the Department of Planning solicits each of the 8 city agencies that participate in the capital budget, their priorities, and worked for the development of the capital budget. So, I think the Finance Department talked a little bit about this year's changes. We started with a lot of uncertainty, but we also had quite a bit of optimism this year, and some really good things came out of it. So after a study, the Department of Finance agreed to increase the amount of bond authorization we will go to the voters for in November. It's increasing from $80 million a year to $125 million a year, biggest increase ever. This is a cap now. We created a Board of Finance, created a new policy to review the amount that we actually budget every year on an annual basis, but we will ask the voters to authorize $125 million a year in GO bonds, and that may go up every 2 years. That's the goal. So we're trying to make up for some deferred costs that we have not been able to handle. In addition, the FY25 230 CIP shows the projected amounts of highway user revenue that the budget director just mentioned. You may remember at the beginning of the state's General Assembly that those funds were on the block. I think we successfully at least retained them for this year and hopefully the next 2 years, with the caveat that it, as you can see, falls off a cliff again after FY28. This is a reminder of how important the GO bonds are. Because most of the budget, at least 3/4 of the budget, is restricted funding. It can't be used outside of the purpose of the revenue bonds for utilities, even the highway user revenue, which can be both operating or capital, but it's still restricted to transportation related. Most federal and state funds also have restrictions and also require a match. So these green wedges here, really, that's really precious money. That's money that we can use to satisfy our highest priorities. Let's see, another substantial portion of the capital budget, state and federal funds, federal highway funds, I just went over this, require a 20% local match. So we have to make sure that we use local funds to meet the local match. Next slide is this is how the capital budget looks by agency and source. So at the top 2/3 of this chart, really in green, shows the use of the flexible GO bonds and HR funds. The bottom, the red ones, are restricted funds. So you can see the amount of restricted compared to the amount of unrestricted. I'm not going to go through these line by line, but it gives you a sense of agency funding. Transportation, well, water and wastewater are the largest. Transportation is the next largest. And that number reflects both the federal highway funds and the local and state funds. Agencies like General Services, which is responsible for most of the municipal buildings, fire stations, police stations, health department, community action centers, downtown campus, are entirely dependent on local funds. So if you're interested in the details of this, please go to our website and you'll see the breakdown by agency. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. And
on, and I can't move it, so it was blocking the very bottom of the slides. But it looked like in terms of revenue for property tax, it looked like you would be expecting that Group 1 assessments would also be up next year. based on the fact that there were big jumps for Group 2 and Group 3. Group 1 missed out on that because of, it looks like, the pandemic.
Yes.
So would that be true, that you would expect/project another good year property tax-wise next year?
So on the property tax, Group 1 includes the downtown core, that includes, that would capture the bulk of our commercial property that we know has been impacted on the flip side, where
So
we've
maybe
seen
not.
drops in assessed value. So I do think that, and I do think that we could potentially see this trend start to change in fiscal '26. One of the things to keep in mind is with the increases and decreases, especially on the residential side, where we saw these big increases in Group 2 and 3, those get phased in over multiple years because of the homestead tax credit. But if there's a reduction in assessed value, the property owner gets to take that savings essentially
Right away.
all at once. And so I think we'll have to see in fiscal '26 sort of the interaction of all of those ups and downs. I do not think that we will see the same level of increases that we saw in '24 and '25 on the property tax side next year.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Second, the change that you're instituting in terms of having agencies not budget the revenue for anticipated grants, I assume, dangerous, that in the past, when agencies were including anticipated grants in their revenue, they were also including grant-based expenses in their budgets that would be paid for with that anticipated revenue. If you're not having them budget the revenue, are they also not budgeting those expenses?
That's correct. So the revenue and the expenditures are out. So if an agency receives a grant award that's not part of the fiscal '25 budget package after July 1st, we will bring a supplemental to the Board of Estimates and City Council to amend the fiscal '25 budget. What I would say that we were seeing is sort of two things. We had agencies that had these big, what we called unallocated appropriations, and those were based off of anticipated awards, and it was really distorting what the real federal and state grant picture was. The other thing that we saw happening was that there were phantom grants that just kept rolling forward. So maybe 5 years ago you had some sort of 3-year grant with FEMA that you had in the budget, but if that wasn't if somebody didn't intentionally go in and take that out, it was rolling forward, and agencies were still having, they could still access those expenditures. And so collectively we were able to get rid of phantom amounts, and then we were able to also bring the anticipated awards more in line with the reality of what we anticipate receiving.
Okay. That sounds great in both cases. And then the last one, and this was just something that I thought of during the planning director's talk. Capital, we generally accept that capital excludes vehicles.
That's correct.
Is there an exception made for the really big expensive vehicles like, fire trucks, something like that? Or do they still get treated as vehicles even if they cost millions of dollars?
They still get treated as vehicles, and so you'll find the budget for the purchase of new apparatus that lives within the fire department's budget in their facility and maintenance service, and then the master lease program that's part of the Department of General Services would include the replacement of fire apparatus. So all of the dollars for our equipment, whether it's a $20,000 sedan or a $3 million piece of fire apparatus, that's living in the operating budget rather than the capital budget.
Is that up to us? Is that a policy decision, or is there some type of best practice accounting principle that constrains it?
It is a Board of Estimates policy, and so it has been something that I have discussed with Director Attila and his team at DGS. I can say from my experience in other jurisdictions that some of those expenditures have lived in the capital budget.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if the Board of Estimates policy already factors in, expected lifetime of the asset.
Yeah.
And if there's a cash threshold such that there would be the opportunity for some of the larger
Yeah.
vehicle purchases to count as capital.
I agree. There's definitely nuance in the assets that fall into the fleet. I think, you all have heard me talk a lot about the need to increase what we are doing in terms of the capital program, and that's a top priority. And so I think as we see getting a little bit more, a more robust capital program, that's one of the things that I want to look at, because when you have those very, very expensive fleet assets, it makes it difficult to make sure that those dollars can stretch to all of the different assets in the fleet. It puts a lot of pressure on the operating budget, and so I do think that there are some ways that we can look at that differently, especially as we look to enhance the capital program.
I look forward to that conversation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Comptroller. Are there any additional questions or concerns from members of the board? We're all good. Hearing and seeing none, that'll conclude today's briefing. Just for the general purpose of the of citizens and folks that are participating in this discussion, I know the mayor's probably seen this presentation and helped go through it 20 times. I think my team has seen it maybe 3 times up to date. I'm pretty sure the comptroller is a lot. So that's why there's not necessarily a whole lot of questions from the board when we do it, but we do it in a public format, to allow the public a chance to understand and know that this is moving through the process of the budget. And the next step in that process is Taxpayers Night in front of the Board of Estimates. That's an opportunity for citizens of Baltimore, organizations, to come in front of the Board of Estimates to provide any questions, concerns, or complaints associated with the proposed budget. So that will take place today at 6 p.m. So we look forward for all citizens to come and participate. I think we already have close to 30 folks already signed up to testify. We look to see more, and your BOE will be here to hear from you. So with that, that'll adjourn today's special meeting. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor.